I had made her favorite poached salmon with lemon butter roasted carrots and a peach tart from scratch. I even found the old floral linen, the one with the frayed edges she used to scold me about but secretly adored. It was Clara's 64th birthday, and I told myself this year might be different, not better maybe, but quieter. The table was set for 6, Clara at the head, flanked by her bridge partner Helen, our cousin Diane, and 2 neighbors who had known me since I was a teenager. I poured the wine, offered smiles past dishes. It was almost easy to pretend this was love. Then Clara raised her glass to aging without baggage, she said, smirking as she swirled the wine. And to finally having a life free of dead weight. She looked directly at me. Honestly, Emory, the best gift you could give me is to leave my life. No one spoke. Helen coughed softly. Diane's fork paused midair. I stared at Clara, blinking once, then twice. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't want to hear it again. I stood slowly, excused myself with a smile that wasn't mine, and walked to the kitchen. I rinsed my hands under cool water until they numbed. Then I took my coat from the hook and left without saying goodbye. That night, I sat in the dim kitchen, still in my coat. The tart was untouched on the counter. The sink held empty glasses, wine-stained and half-rinsed. I looked at the chair where she had sat back straight, eyes smug, and wondered how long she had been rehearsing that sentence. Maybe she hadn't. Maybe it was instinct. I thought of all the birthdays before this, the ones I spent making hand-sewn gifts as a child, the years I decorated her front porch with candles, the decades of trying to earn something she never planned to give. I got up, placed the tart in the fridge, and stared at the dishes. I didn't clean them. I went to bed with the taste of silence in my mouth and her words ringing in my ears. The next morning, I opened my journal to a blank page. The page stayed blank for a long time. I held the pen but didn't write. My hand hovered over the paper like it was waiting for permission. And in the stillness of that morning, the memories came uninvited. I was 26 when I dropped out of grad school. Clara had slipped on the ice outside her porch and fractured her hip. "You're all I have," she said over the phone, her voice thin and manipulative. I remember the way the professor's face fell when I told him I wouldn't be finishing the semester. "Just take a leave," he said gently. I nodded, but I never went back. I moved back into the house that week. It was supposed to be temporary. Years passed in increments. Appointments, medication, groceries, errands. I took a job at a local library. Flexible hours close to home. I dated quietly, but never seriously. Every time someone asked about a future mine, I found a way to change the subject. When Clara asked if she could freshen up the house, I agreed. She painted over the yellow hallway I loved and replaced the kitchen tiles with cold gray squares. "It's more modern," she said. I convinced myself it didn't matter. It was still home, even if it didn't look like mine. I let her throw out the chair I bought during my first job. I laughed it off when she called it tacky. I said yes to every little no. That was our rhythm, she asked. I adjusted. But now, in the quiet of this morning, it felt different. The pattern wasn't devotion. It was disappearance. A slow unraveling strand by strand until I couldn't tell where I ended and her expectations began. I lowered the pen and finally wrote something. I gave up so much trying not to make her feel alone. But I never asked if I was allowed to want more than surviving her. The ink bled into the page. I tore it out, folded it carefully, and tucked it in the back of the journal. Then I pulled open the filing drawer and began looking for my bank statements. I didn't sleep that night. My mind paced even when my body didn't move. I kept replaying all the moments I should have said something, drawn a line, made a choice that centered me instead of her. But I hadn't. I had waited for the situation to become unbearable before I dared to name it. In the morning, I made tea but didn't drink it. I sat at the kitchen table, opened a new journal, and wrote the sentence as if it had been waiting years to exist. I have been edited out of my own life. The words landed harder on paper than they did in my chest. I read them twice, then underlined them once. Then I began. I made a list of everything Clara had access to. Joint accounts, the house, deed, my password scribbled on that kitchen notepad. She always pretended not to notice. I circled the things that needed to change first. Next, I gathered all the paperwork I could find, insurance forms, bank statements, the will I had signed without reading years ago. I called the bank and scheduled an appointment to remove her as an authorized user. I searched for legal referrals and found a small law office 2 towns over. The lawyer's name was Daniel Carter. I liked the sound of it firm, not flashy. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not Diane, not my neighbor, certainly not Clara. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even anger. It was air. After holding my breath for over a decade that afternoon, I stood in the hallway and looked around the house, not with sentiment, but with precision. What was mine? What had been given and what had been taken without consent? My eyes landed on the old oak desk near the window. It was the last thing my father had touched before he died. I opened the drawer and pulled out the small envelope where he used to keep emergency cash. It was empty. The next day, I drove to meet the lawyer. Clara noticed. Not right away, but soon enough. I stopped reminding her about appointments. I no longer filled in the silences with polite conversation. I cooked only for myself using the small pan instead of the big one we used to share. She began hovering again, offering half-sincere smiles, commenting on my clothes like she was trying to sound maternal. One morning, she tapped on my door with a tray of burnt toast and oversteeped tea. "I figured you'd be tired," she said gently. "We haven't talked much since." Well, she waved a hand vaguely, pretending not to remember the words she had etched into the center of my chest. "You mean your birthday?" I asked. She blinked. "That? Oh, come on, Emory. It was a joke. I was tipsy. People say things." I nodded but didn't let her in. Later that week, I sat across from a bank manager as she pulled up my account history. I watched her face change with each line she scrolled through. "Someone's been transferring funds regularly to another checking account," she said. "They're small amounts but consistent, over $6,000 this past year." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I already knew. That evening, I found Clara folding towels in the laundry room. She looked up with that tired expression she wore like armor. "I saw the withdrawals," I said. She straightened. "What are you talking about?" "My account. Thousands taken without asking." Clara sighed and dropped a towel into the basket. "You're overreacting. It was for things we needed repairs, prescriptions, your car maintenance." "You never asked." "You wouldn't have minded," she snapped. "You always said we're in this together." "God, Emory, you're being so selfish." I stared at her. "Selfish," I repeated. "Yes," she said, her voice rising. "You act like you're owed something just for living here." I didn't reply. I walked past her up the stairs and into my room. I locked the door behind me not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to explain the boundary out loud. The next morning, I found a letter in the mailbox without a return address. The envelope was plain, the paper thick, folded neatly in thirds. There was no return address, but I recognized the handwriting before I opened it, neat, slightly slanted, written with care. Mrs. Thompson lived 2 doors down. We'd spoken maybe a dozen times in 15 years. She always waved from her porch, but never lingered. "Dear Emory, I hope you don't mind the letter. I don't want to intrude, but I've watched from my window for a long time. Not to be nosy, just to bear witness. I've seen what you've carried, what you've given the way you disappear to make others more comfortable. You are not invisible, Emory, and you are not wrong. With quiet admiration, Margaret Thompson." I read it twice then, once more, just to feel the words again. My eyes stung not from pain, but from the foreign comfort of being seen without having to explain myself. I folded the letter along its original crease and slipped it into the back pocket of my journal next to the torn page I had written after the birthday. It didn't fix anything, but it steadied something in me that had been wobbling for years. That evening, I made dinner just for myself and didn't offer to share. Clara didn't ask. When the dishes were done, I opened my laptop and searched for a notary near the county clerk's office. I had already called Daniel Carter. The next step would be signing the documents. I checked the locks before I went to bed, then placed the journal on the nightstand where I could see it. The next morning, I dressed in quiet clothes and drove to the attorney's office. Daniel was calm, measured, and precise. His office smelled faintly of cedar, and the walls were lined with certificates I didn't need to read. I trusted him the moment he said, "You don't need a war, you need a boundary that holds." We spent the better part of an hour signing papers. He walked me through every step, freezing joint accounts, updating the deed, revising my will. At the end, he slid the final form toward me. I hesitated only briefly before signing. Outside, the wind had picked up. By the time I got home, the first drops of rain had started. Clara was in the kitchen. She looked up from her crossword. "Where have you been?" Her eyes narrowed. "You've been distant lately and secretive." "I don't like it." I said nothing. I went upstairs. That night, the storm came not from the sky, but through the phone. It started with a voicemail from Cousin Sarah. "What's going on over there? Your mom called. Said you're freezing her out. That's cruel Emory." Then came the texts from old neighbors, the passive-aggressive ones just checking in, heard some worrying things. And then Diane, who didn't bother sugarcoating it, "I can't believe you do this to her after everything she's done for you." I turned my phone face down and let it buzz itself into silence. Downstairs, doors slammed harder than they needed to. Cabinet drawers opened and shut with sharp intent. Clara moved through the house with heavy footsteps as if sound alone could carry her blame up the stairs. I stayed in my room and wrote it all down. I am not punishing her. I am reclaiming what is mine. The next morning, Clara banged on my door. "You've made your point," she snapped. "Now undo it." I opened the door just enough to speak. "It's not a game, Clara. There's nothing to undo." She stared at me, incredulous. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," I said, "but at least this regret will be mine." I shut the door and locked it. 2 days later, a notice was delivered to the house official, notarized and irreversible. By the end of the week, Clara was gone. She didn't say goodbye. I heard her dragging luggage across the hardwood floor just after dawn. Her voice, sharp and muttering, carried through the walls as she called someone to pick her up. A car idled out front for 10 minutes. Then the door slammed and I heard nothing else. I waited an hour before coming downstairs. The living room was still. A few picture frames were missing, some drawers left open, but the bones of the house had stayed. My house, my name on the deed, now uncontested. The quiet pressed in, but this time it didn't feel like accusation. It felt like breath, like space. I started slowly. The painting of the wildflowers I'd tucked away 5 years ago, I hung it back above the fireplace. I changed the bulbs in the hallway to warm light. I brought my grandmother's quilt down from the attic and spread it over the couch, the blue and green stitching still soft under my palms. I opened every window in the house. Let the air move through each room until it carried her scent away. Later that evening, I found an old tea tin at the back of the cupboard, the one I used to keep tucked in my nightstand drawer before Clara declared it clutter. I brewed a cup and drank it on the back porch legs tucked under me, the sun slipping behind the trees. I thought I might cry, but I didn't. Not then. Instead, I sat with a calm so quiet I almost didn't recognize it. Not relief, not victory. Something else. Something like return. That night, I slept with the bedroom door open. The next morning, I registered for an art class at the community center. The room smelled faintly of pencil shavings and turpentine, warm, lived in without expectation. No one asked me why I was there. No one asked my last name. I found a seat near the back, opened my sketchbook, and waited. The instructor, a woman named Rachel with silver-streaked curls and paint on her sleeves, welcomed everyone without fanfare. "We're not here to be good," she said. "We're here to begin." I hadn't drawn since I was 22. Not really. Not since I left school and tucked that part of myself away like a luxury I couldn't afford. The first few lines were hesitant, my hand stiff and unfamiliar with movement that once felt instinctive. But by the second class, something shifted. I wasn't drawing to be seen. I was drawing because it felt like breathing again. No one in the room knew about Clara. No one knew about the bank accounts or the slammed doors or the birthday toast that had cracked something open. They only knew the way I shaded light, the way I smudged with the side of my thumb, the way I laughed softly, surprised when someone told a joke under their breath. It was enough. Each week, I came home with charcoal under my nails and a sense of stillness I didn't try to explain. I began rearranging the house one corner at a time. I painted the guest bathroom a pale sage. I moved the reading lamp to the other side of the couch. I filled frames with my own sketches. quiet portraits of hands trees, and once a single daisy. One afternoon, I found myself humming while cooking. It startled me. I hadn't made noise just to fill space in years. That evening, I sat by the window with my journal and wrote one sentence: I'm not building a new life. I'm remembering the one I left behind. And then the phone rang. It was her voice, hollowed out but unmistakable. "Emory," she said barely above a whisper. "It's me." I didn't say anything. "I'm not well," she continued. "The doctors found something and I thought you should know." I let the silence stretch. She sighed. "The kids ask about you. They miss you. We all do." It was the word "we" that struck hardest. I could picture her saying it, her hand on her chest, like it justified everything that came before. "I'm sorry," she added softer now. "I said things I didn't mean. But this house doesn't feel right without you. None of it does." I looked out the window where the daisy sketch now hung in the corner of the glass. The light hit it differently every hour. It had become a kind of clock for me, marking time by how it changed. "I'm glad the kids are well," I said, "and I hope you're getting the care you need." She paused. "So, can we talk? Maybe come by just to see you." I closed my eyes. "I can't go back to being small so you can feel big," I said quietly. She exhaled, sharply wounded or angry, I couldn't tell which. "So that's it. That's it." She hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just sat there breathing. The quiet didn't feel like punishment anymore. The next morning I stepped out into the garden with a trowel in one hand and a packet of seeds in the other. The soil was dry but soft, the kind that welcomed change. I pressed the lavender seedlings into the earth, gently spacing them with care, then followed with sage along the back edge of the fence. I didn't rush. Each handful of dirt felt like a promise. When I stood to stretch my back, the sun was low and warm across the porch. A breeze moved through the branches, and for the first time in years, I could hear the world without a filter of tension. I stayed out there until the light shifted to gold. Then came the knock. 2 girls stood at my front steps, maybe 7 or 8, their faces open and curious. One held a basket lined with a kitchen towel. "Hi," the taller one said. "These are from my mom." The younger nudged her and added, "She says your garden makes her feel brave." I blinked, caught off guard. "Well, that's very kind," I said, crouching to their level. "Tell her I said thank you." They smiled and ran off before I could say more, their laughter trailing behind them like ribbon. I carried the basket inside and set it on the kitchen table. Still warm, the muffins smelled like cinnamon and apple. I didn't eat one right away. I just stood there, letting the quiet stretch wide around me. Later, I lit a candle in the living room and opened my journal. "I thought disappearing would break me," I wrote. "But maybe I was never meant to be seen by them. Maybe I was meant to see myself." The candle flickered, casting a soft halo of light over the pages, and then I turned to a fresh sheet and began to draw. I sat with my journal, the candle's glow soft on the page, and realized the weight of my choices. Clara's words had cut, but they also freed me. I learned that love shouldn't demand my erasure. For years, I shrank to fit her expectations, believing devotion meant sacrifice. But disappearing for someone else only hollowed me out. Reclaiming my space, my home, my art, my voice taught me that boundaries aren't betrayal, they're survival. I wasn't punishing her. I was choosing myself. The garden, the sketches, the muffins from a neighbor I barely knew, they showed me that life grows where you make room for it. I don't need to be loud to be seen just steady in my own skin. Clara's absence didn't break me. It reminded me I was whole before her demands. The lesson wasn't about winning or losing, it was about remembering who I am when no one else is watching. I turned the page, ready to write my own story, not as a shadow, but as Emory unapologetically here.
I was 10 years old when my parents decided I was too expensive to keep. Not too difficult, not too much trouble. Too expensive. The exact amount of my childhood's worth, according to them, was $13,000. That's what my Uncle Robert paid them to take me in after they showed up at his door on a Tuesday evening in March, dragging me behind them like damaged merchandise they were returning to the store. I didn't understand the transaction then. I thought maybe Uncle Robert had invited me for an extended sleepover, or that my parents needed a break and would come back for me when things got better at home. I waited by his front window for 6 months, watching for their familiar blue Honda to pull into the driveway. Every afternoon after school, I'd press my face against the glass and scan the street for any sign of them returning. Uncle Robert never told me they weren't coming back. He just let me figure it out gradually, the way children eventually stop believing in Santa Claus. Not all at once, but through a slow accumulation of evidence that the story doesn't quite add up. The $13,000 I learned years later when I was old enough to understand legal documents was supposed to cover my basic expenses until I turned 18. Food, clothing, school supplies, and medical care for 8 years. All paid in advance with a single check and a signature on papers that transferred all legal responsibility for my welfare to Uncle Robert. My parents walked away that night and never looked back, never called to check how I was adjusting, never sent a birthday card or Christmas present. Uncle Robert kept the receipt. Not just the canceled check, but all the paperwork. Custody transfer documents, health records, school enrollment forms, and a handwritten note from my mother listing my allergies and preferred bedtime routine. He filed everything in a manila folder labeled Sarah's Adoption and stored it in his home office safe, along with his important documents, financial records, and will. "Someday you might need proof of what happened," he told me when I was 16 and accidentally discovered the folder while helping him organize his desk for tax season. Some people have selective memories about their own behavior, especially when money becomes involved. I thought he was being paranoid. I couldn't imagine why I'd ever need evidence of my parents abandoning me. Who would I need to convince? What would I need to prove? The abandonment was a painful fact of my life, not a legal case requiring documentation. But Uncle Robert had spent 40 years as a corporate attorney specializing in family law and estate planning, and he understood that families could be far more ruthless than business competitors when inheritance money was involved. He documented everything with the meticulous attention to detail that had made him successful in law. Every school event he attended alone, every parent-teacher conference where he was listed as guardian, every medical appointment where he signed as the responsible party. He maintained detailed financial records showing exactly how much he spent on my care, education, and activities, not because he expected reimbursement, but because he wanted proof that he'd taken his responsibility seriously. Uncle Robert wasn't perfect, but he was consistently present. He attended every school play, even the terrible ones where I forgot my lines. He helped with homework every night, patiently explaining algebra and history and chemistry until concepts clicked. He taught me to drive in his ancient Buick, gripping the passenger door handle while I learned to parallel park. He paid for college applications, SAT prep courses, and law school tuition without ever making me feel like a financial burden or an investment requiring return on value. When I graduated law school summa cum laude and started my career as a public defender, he was prouder than any biological parent could have been. He kept newspaper clippings of cases I won, framed my law degree next to his own, and bragged to his friends about my daughter the attorney with genuine enthusiasm. "You turned out better than anyone had a right to expect," he said at my graduation dinner at his favorite steakhouse. "Your parents' loss was my greatest gain. Their $13,000 investment in my life paid off far better than any stock portfolio they could have chosen." He never married, never had biological children of his own, and often said that raising me had been the most rewarding experience of his life. Not because I was extraordinary or accomplished, but because I was genuinely grateful for stability. I appreciated things that other children took for granted: consistent meals at predictable times, someone who showed up when they said they would, a safe place to sleep every night without drama or chaos. My biological parents, meanwhile, became strangers with familiar faces who occasionally crossed my path in our small town. Awkward encounters at the grocery store where they'd nod politely and ask generic questions about school or work. Brief mentions in conversations with mutual acquaintances who didn't know our history. They'd moved across town after dropping me off, started fresh without the financial burden and emotional complications of a child, and apparently never looked back with any regret or curiosity about how I was developing. When people asked about my family situation during college or law school, I learned to say that my uncle had raised me after my parents died in an accident. It was easier than explaining abandonment, and it avoided the uncomfortable questions and pitying looks that followed when people learned the truth. Dead parents evoked sympathy and understanding. Living parents who chose to leave evoked confusion, judgment, and uncomfortable speculation about what kind of child gets abandoned by their own family. Uncle Robert knew I told this lie to outsiders, and he never corrected me or suggested I should be more honest about our circumstances. "Sometimes the truth is too complicated for strangers to understand," he said when I admitted feeling guilty about the deception. "Save your energy and emotional labor for people who actually matter in your life." The people who mattered were few but absolutely reliable. My college roommate Emma, who became my closest friend and later my law practice partner when we opened our family law firm together. My boyfriend Michael, who I'd been dating for 3 years and who understood that family loyalty wasn't something I took for granted because I'd learned early that blood relationships didn't guarantee commitment. Uncle Robert's small circle of professional colleagues and neighborhood friends, who treated me like genuine family and never asked uncomfortable questions about my background or why my parents were never mentioned. This chosen family felt more real and substantial than any biological connection I'd lost. When Uncle Robert was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer at age 72, it was Emma and Michael who helped me navigate the overwhelming medical appointments and treatment decisions. It was Uncle Robert's law partner Tom who drove him to chemotherapy sessions when I couldn't take time off work for court appearances. It was his longtime neighbor Mrs. Patterson who brought homemade meals twice a week and checked on him daily when I was traveling for cases. My biological parents never appeared during his 18-month illness. Not to visit, not to call and ask how he was managing, not to send a card or flowers. I don't think they even knew he was sick, since Uncle Robert had severed all contact with them after taking me in, and I'd never felt compelled to re-establish any connection or keep them informed about our lives. Uncle Robert fought the cancer with the same methodical determination he'd brought to everything else in his carefully organized life. He researched treatment options online, consulted with multiple specialists, maintained detailed spreadsheets tracking symptoms and medication effects, and planned for every possible contingency. Even while dying, he was documenting everything, preparing for legal challenges and complications that most people wouldn't consider until it was too late. During his final months, he spent considerable time updating his will, organizing his files, and recording detailed explanations of his financial decisions. "I want to make sure there are no surprises or ambiguities," he told me during one of our evening conversations about estate planning. "Some people might question my choices after I'm gone, and I want my reasoning to be crystal clear." I assumed he was being overly cautious about typical estate issues. Tax implications, charitable donations, or provisions for longtime employees. I never imagined he was preparing for my biological parents to emerge from 24 years of silence to claim a portion of his wealth. The end came peacefully at home on a Saturday morning in October. I was holding his hand while he slept. Emma was reading aloud from his favorite mystery novel in case he could still hear us, and Mrs. Patterson was keeping vigil from the kitchen, making sure we had everything we needed and handling phone calls from concerned friends. He died surrounded by people who genuinely loved him, which felt like the perfect ending to a life that had been built on kindness, consistency, and choosing to show up when it mattered. I called the funeral home, the family lawyer, and Uncle Robert's closest friends to begin making arrangements. The funeral was planned for Thursday afternoon. A simple service followed by burial in the historic cemetery where his parents were laid to rest. I expected maybe 30 or 40 people to attend, mostly his professional colleagues, longtime neighbors, and the small community of people who had been part of our quiet, stable life. I did not expect my biological parents to show up at the funeral home on Wednesday evening, dressed in expensive clothing that suggested they'd achieved the financial success they'd prioritized over parenting, carrying elaborate flower arrangements like they were grieving family members who had suffered a devastating loss. I was reviewing the funeral program with the director and finalizing music selections when they walked into the lobby. 24 years since they dropped me off at Uncle Robert's house with a suitcase and a check, and they looked exactly the same but wealthier. Designer clothes with current season styling, professional manicures and styled hair, the kind of confident posture that comes from financial security and social status. "Sarah," my mother said, approaching me with arms extended like she expected a hug, as if we'd maintained a relationship that would make physical affection normal. "We're so sorry for your loss. Robert was such a wonderful man, and we know how much he meant to you." I stood frozen in the funeral home lobby, unable to process their presence or understand why they were there. "What are you doing here?" "He was family," my father said, his voice carrying the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a confused child. We're here to pay our respects and support you during this difficult time. That's what family members do for each other. The audacity was breathtaking. 24 years of complete absence, zero contact, no birthday calls or holiday cards or graduation congratulations, and now they wanted to claim family status at Uncle Robert's funeral. You sold me to him for $13,000, I said quietly, aware that the funeral director was pretending not to listen while clearly absorbing every word of this unexpected family drama. That's not how we remember it, my mother replied smoothly, her voice carrying the practiced quality of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. We made a difficult decision during a challenging financial period to ensure you had the best possible care with someone who could provide for you properly. Robert was family, and it made sense for family to help family. You never visited. You never called. You never sent a birthday card in 24 years. We thought it was better for everyone if we gave you space to adjust to your new living situation, Dad said with the same rehearsed tone. Robert agreed that a clean break would be easier for you emotionally, and we respected his judgment about what was best for your development. I stared at them, recognizing the careful way they were reframing abandonment as thoughtful decision-making, neglect as respectful boundaries, and complete absence as mature parenting strategy. They'd clearly discussed this approach and prepared explanations that made their behavior sound reasonable and loving. The funeral is tomorrow, I said, my voice steady despite the surreal nature of the conversation. You're welcome to attend if you feel the need. Please don't approach me or pretend we have a relationship that we don't actually have. I left them standing in the funeral home lobby with their expensive flowers and walked out to my car, immediately calling Emma and Michael. I needed witnesses for whatever was coming next, because Uncle Robert's paranoia about documentation was starting to make perfect sense. The funeral service was beautiful and well attended by people who had actually known and cared about Uncle Robert. His law colleagues shared stories about his professional integrity and generous mentorship of younger attorneys. His longtime friends talked about his kindness, his dry sense of humor, and his devotion to raising me as a single parent. Mrs. Patterson cried through her entire eulogy about what a wonderful neighbor he'd been for 15 years, always helping with yard work and bringing in packages when she traveled. My biological parents sat in the back row, dressed appropriately and behaving respectfully throughout the service. They didn't approach me during the reception, but I felt their presence like a weight I couldn't shake, watching and waiting for something. After the burial, they lingered near the gravesite until most people had left, then approached me with the same confident demeanor they displayed at the funeral home. We'd like to talk about Robert's estate, my father said without preamble or any pretense of grief. We should probably discuss family assets and how to handle the inheritance situation appropriately. What inheritance? I asked, though the question was becoming rhetorical as their intentions clarified. Don't be naive, Sarah. Robert was a successful corporate attorney who never married and never had biological children of his own. His estate is substantial, and as his surviving family members, we have certain legal expectations about how it should be distributed according to state inheritance laws. I looked at them standing beside Uncle Robert's fresh grave, discussing money while dirt was still settling on his coffin and flowers were wilting in the October heat. I'm his family. You're strangers who showed up to his funeral uninvited. Blood is blood, my mother said, her voice taking on a harder edge. Robert was our brother. Legal family relationships matter in estate proceedings, regardless of personal feelings or recent history. We're not here to fight or cause problems, Dad added, though his tone suggested exactly the opposite. We just want to make sure everyone gets what they're legally entitled to. This should be handled fairly and according to proper inheritance procedures. I told them to contact the family lawyer if they had questions about the estate, then left with Emma and Michael, who had witnessed the entire exchange. But their words haunted me through the evening and into a sleepless night. Legal relationships. Inheritance procedures. These weren't people expressing grief or offering emotional support during a difficult time. These were people positioning themselves for a financial transaction they'd been planning since learning about Uncle Robert's death. The will reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 10 a.m. in the downtown office of Uncle Robert's attorney, James Morrison. I arrived 15 minutes early, expecting a simple formality. Uncle Robert would have left everything to me, as the only person who'd been consistently present in his life for 24 years and the daughter he'd chosen to raise and support through law school. My biological parents arrived exactly on time, accompanied by their own attorney, a sharp-dressed woman carrying multiple briefcases and legal folders. They'd clearly spent the weekend preparing for this meeting, bringing documentation, prepared arguments, and what looked like a comprehensive legal strategy for challenging whatever they didn't like about Uncle Robert's final wishes. This wasn't a family gathering to honor a deceased relative's memory. This was a business meeting where they expected to negotiate their share of an inheritance. James Morrison, Uncle Robert's longtime attorney and friend, reviewed the will methodically, reading each provision aloud and explaining the legal implications with professional detachment. Uncle Robert's estate was worth exactly $18 million, accumulated through decades of successful legal practice representing corporate clients, wise real estate investments and careful financial planning that had grown his savings consistently over 40 years of work. The house I'd grown up in was valued at an additional $1.2 million, having appreciated significantly since he'd purchased it in the 1980s. His investment portfolio included stocks, bonds, retirement accounts, and a small commercial property he'd bought as a young attorney and rented to local businesses. Everything, the money, the house, the investments, the personal property, even his law library, was left to me. Not a percentage, not a portion, not with any conditions or restrictions that would allow challenges. Everything with a single paragraph explaining his decision in language that was both legally precise and emotionally clear. Sarah has been my daughter in every way that matters for 24 years. She deserves the security and opportunities that this inheritance can provide, and I trust her to use these resources wisely to build the life she chooses. My parents' attorney immediately objected before Mr. Morrison had finished reading. We need to discuss the legitimacy of this will and whether Mr. Harrison was under any undue influence when he drafted these provisions. This distribution seems highly irregular given the presence of surviving blood relatives. The will was drafted 8 years ago and updated annually with consistent provisions, Mr. Morrison replied calmly. Mr. Harrison was mentally competent throughout this period, acted without any coercion, and expressed his wishes clearly and consistently in multiple legal documents. Sarah lived with him for years and had daily access to manipulate his decisions and isolate him from his biological family, my mother said, her voice carrying the rehearsed quality of someone who'd practiced this argument. There are clear questions about whether he was influenced to exclude his rightful heirs. What biological family? I asked, my voice steady despite the surreal nature of accusing me of manipulating the man who'd raised me. You abandoned both of us 24 years ago. We made a temporary custody arrangement during a difficult financial period, Dad said, using the same script he'd prepared for the funeral home. We always intended to maintain family relationships and eventual reunification when circumstances improved. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat and reached into his desk drawer. Actually, I have something directly relevant to this discussion. He pulled out a small digital recording device and placed it on the conference table between us. Mr. Harrison anticipated that his will might be challenged by family members, so he asked me to record his detailed explanation of his decisions. He pressed play and Uncle Robert's familiar voice filled the room with the clarity and authority he'd brought to every legal argument. If you're hearing this recording, it means my will is being contested by my brother and his wife, probably with claims that Sarah manipulated me or isolated me from family connections. Let me be absolutely clear about the facts they don't want acknowledged publicly. In March 1999, my brother David and his wife Linda brought their 10-year-old daughter Sarah to my house and asked me to take permanent custody of her. They could no longer afford to raise her properly, and they wanted to start fresh without the financial burden and daily responsibility of a child. I paid them $13,000 to cover immediate legal fees and her transition needs. This was not a temporary arrangement during financial hardship. This was not a difficult period requiring family support until they got back on their feet. This was a permanent transaction where they sold me their daughter because she was inconvenient, expensive, and interfered with their plans for their future. For 24 years they never visited Sarah. Never called on her birthday or during holidays. Never sent a Christmas card or graduation gift. Never asked how she was doing in school, whether she needed anything or if she was happy and healthy. They erased her from their lives completely and moved on as if she had never existed. When Sarah broke her arm in middle school, the hospital couldn't reach them at their listed phone number. When she won academic awards in high school, they weren't there to celebrate. When she graduated college summa cum laude, they didn't attend the ceremony. When she passed the bar exam and started her legal career, they never congratulated her or expressed pride in her accomplishments. Sarah has been my daughter, my pride, and my greatest joy for 24 years. She earned every dollar I'm leaving her through love, loyalty, gratitude, and simply showing up when it mattered. She was there during my cancer treatment, holding my hand through chemotherapy and helping me maintain dignity during the worst periods of illness. If my brother and his wife want family money, they should try being family members instead of strangers who appear only when there's an inheritance to claim. Sarah's my real daughter. They are biological relatives who chose financial convenience over parental responsibility 24 years ago. The recording ended and the room fell completely silent. Even the traffic noise from the busy street outside seemed to fade as the weight of Uncle Robert's words settled over everyone present. My parents' attorney was already gathering her papers and closing briefcases. We'll need time to review the legal implications of these recordings and determine our next steps regarding this matter. What legal implications? Mr. Morrison asked with genuine curiosity. Mr. Harrison documented a factual account of events that occurred 24 years ago. If you'd like to dispute his version of events, you're welcome to provide contradictory evidence that supports a different narrative. My father stood up abruptly, his face red with anger and embarrassment. We gave her the best possible life with someone who could provide for her properly. We sacrificed our relationship with our daughter to ensure she had opportunities we couldn't offer at the time. You sold me, I said quietly, pulling out the manila folder I'd brought from Uncle Robert's home office safe. Uncle Robert kept the receipt and all the documentation. I spread the contents across the conference table methodically. The original custody transfer papers with both parents' signatures. The canceled check for $13,000 made out to Robert Harrison Child Care Services. Medical records showing I hadn't seen a doctor paid for by my biological parents since age 10. School records listing Uncle Robert as emergency contact and financially responsible party for 8 consecutive years. A handwritten note from my mother explaining my food allergies and bedtime routine, as if she were leaving instructions for a babysitter. This is a receipt from when you sold me to Uncle Robert for $13,000. This is a letter from my elementary school principal asking why you stopped returning their calls about parent-teacher conferences and academic issues. This is a medical record showing that Uncle Robert paid for my broken arm treatment because the hospital couldn't reach you when they called your emergency contact numbers. I continued placing documents on the table. Here's my high school graduation program where Uncle Robert is listed as my guardian. Here's my college application where he's listed as the parent providing financial support. Here's my law school graduation announcement that was never sent to you because we had no contact information. I looked directly at them. You want to talk about legal relationships and family entitlement? Here's 24 years of legal documentation showing that you abandoned me completely and Uncle Robert raised me as his own child with no support, interference, or involvement from either of you. My mother was crying now, but they weren't tears of grief or regret about lost relationships. They were tears of frustration that their strategy wasn't working and their claims weren't being accepted. We always loved you, Sarah. We just thought we hoped that Robert. You hoped Uncle Robert would die and leave you money, I interrupted. You thought $18 million was worth pretending to care about the daughter you sold 24 years ago for the price of a used car. Their attorney was already standing and making polite excuses about needing to review the case further. We'll be in touch about potential legal challenges to this will and inheritance distribution. Please do, Mr. Morrison replied with the confident tone of someone who'd handled similar cases for decades. I have 8 years of documentation showing Mr. Harrison's consistent wishes, plus detailed records of every interaction he had with his brother over the past 24 years. Spoiler alert, there weren't any interactions to document. After they left, I sat in the law office trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 1 week, I'd gone from being an orphan public defender living on a modest salary to being an $18 million heiress with biological parents who wanted to sue me for inheritance money. What happens next? I asked Mr. Morrison, who was organizing the legal documents back into proper files. They'll probably file a will contest claiming undue influence or lack of capacity, he said matter-of-factly. It won't succeed. Your uncle was meticulous about documentation, and their complete absence from your life actually strengthens the legal case for his decision. No court is going to award them a portion of an inheritance from the man who raised you when they voluntarily abandoned all parental rights and responsibilities. How long will this legal process take? 6 months to a year, depending on how aggressive they want to be and how much money they're willing to spend on legal fees. But Sarah, you should know they cannot win this case. They abandoned legal and practical responsibility for you 24 years ago in exchange for a cash payment. No court in this jurisdiction is going to award them inheritance rights from the person who took over their obligations. He was absolutely right. The legal challenge lasted 8 months and cost my parents approximately $150,000 in attorney fees and court costs. Every deposition revealed more evidence of their abandonment. Every document they provided contradicted their claims about maintaining family relationships or intending eventual reunification. The court case became a public record of their behavior that anyone could access. Testimony about the $13,000 payment for transferring custody. Evidence of 24 years of no contact with their daughter. Uncle Robert's recording explaining exactly why he'd chosen to leave everything to me instead of his biological relatives. Their attorney tried multiple strategies, claiming the will was invalid, arguing that I had manipulated Uncle Robert's decisions, suggesting that he lacked mental capacity during his final years. Each approach failed when confronted with documentation, medical records, and witness testimony about Uncle Robert's careful planning and consistent wishes. The judge dismissed their case with prejudice, meaning they couldn't file the same claims again. In her final ruling, she wrote, "The plaintiffs voluntarily relinquished all parental rights and responsibilities 24 years ago in exchange for monetary consideration. They cannot now claim family status for the purpose of inheritance when they abandoned both family relationships and family obligations decades ago for their own financial convenience. My parents had to pay my legal fees in addition to their own unsuccessful lawsuit costs. The total financial cost of their failed inheritance grab was approximately $275,000. Money they spent trying to claim an inheritance from a brother they'd ignored for 24 years while he raised their daughter. But the real cost was public exposure and social consequences. The case made local news because of the unusual circumstances and the large inheritance amount. Their friends, neighbors, colleagues, and professional associates learned that they'd sold their 10-year-old daughter and then tried to sue her for her inheritance 24 years later. I used a significant portion of Uncle Robert's money to establish a foundation providing legal assistance to children in custody disputes, adoption proceedings, and family situations where adults had prioritized financial gain over children's welfare. Every year, we help dozens of kids navigate family situations that adults have made unnecessarily complicated with greed, abandonment, or legal manipulation. The foundation also provides scholarships for children who've been raised by relatives or chosen family members, recognizing that some of the best parents are people who choose to love children rather than people who simply share DNA with them. My biological parents still live in the same town, but we move in completely different social and professional circles. I occasionally hear updates through mutual acquaintances. They've struggled financially since their lawsuit failed and the legal fees depleted their savings, lost some long-time friendships when the story became public knowledge, and apparently still complain privately about being cut out of Robert's will by a manipulative daughter who turned him against his own family. I've never reached out to them and they've never approached me again. The lawsuit was their final attempt to extract financial value from a relationship they'd abandoned decades ago. When that failed completely, they apparently decided I wasn't worth any further effort or attention. Emma sometimes asks if I feel guilty about having so much inherited wealth while my biological parents struggle with financial difficulties. The answer is no, and it's not difficult to explain why. Uncle Robert's inheritance wasn't a financial windfall or lucky accident. It was 24 years of love, stability, gratitude, and consistent presence converted into economic security. I earned every dollar by showing up when it mattered, staying committed when things were difficult, and choosing to build a life with people who valued relationships over financial transactions. My biological parents made their choice when I was 10 years old. They decided $13,000 was worth more than their daughter's presence in their lives. Uncle Robert made his choice when he took me in and raised me as his own child for 24 years. He decided that love, loyalty, and chosen family were worth $18 million. Both decisions were honored exactly as intended. My parents got their $13,000 and their freedom from parental responsibility and financial obligation. I got a father who showed up consistently and an inheritance that reflects 24 years of genuine family relationships built on mutual respect and affection. Some people might call this poetic justice or karmic revenge. I call it the natural consequence of treating family relationships like business transactions and prioritizing immediate financial gain over long-term human connections. If you sell your daughter because she's inconvenient and expensive, don't expect to inherit from her chosen father. If you abandon your brother for 24 years, don't expect to benefit from his estate planning. Uncle Robert understood that family is built through presence and choice, not biology and legal obligation. His inheritance plan reflected that understanding perfectly. The people who showed up for 24 years got financial security and recognition. The people who disappeared for 24 years got exactly what they'd chosen when they walked away. Nothing. I think that's exactly how he would have wanted this story to end, with his chosen daughter using his money to help other children navigate the complicated intersection of family relationships and legal systems, while the people who tried to exploit both relationships and legal loopholes got nothing but expensive legal bills and public embarrassment. Some legacies are built on bloodlines and traditional inheritance patterns. Some are built on accumulated wealth and property transfer. Uncle Robert's legacy was built on demonstrating that love doesn't always choose the obvious beneficiaries or follow conventional family structures. Sometimes love chooses the people who show up when showing up is difficult, who stay committed when staying is inconvenient, and who understand that family is something you build through daily choices rather than something you inherit through genetic accident. I'm proud to carry that legacy forward $18 million at a time, helping other children understand that their worth isn't determined by the people who choose to leave, but by the people who choose to stay. The old Victorian house on Maple Street had been in our family for 4 generations. When Grandma Rose passed away 18 months ago, she left it to me in her will, much to my family's surprise and displeasure. At 29, I was the youngest of 3 siblings, working what my family considered a dead-end government job, while my older brothers Marcus and David had both gone into private business. Marcus, 33, ran a struggling construction company that was always one bad contract away from bankruptcy. David, 31, worked in real estate but hadn't closed a significant deal in over a year. They'd both expected to inherit portions of Grandma's estate, particularly the house, which was worth approximately $340,000 in our gentrifying neighborhood. Instead, Grandma's will had been very specific. To my granddaughter Sarah, who visited me every week and listened to my stories, I leave my house and all its contents. She understood the importance of preserving family history. The reading of the will had been uncomfortable. Mom cried, claiming it wasn't fair that the baby of the family got the most valuable asset. Dad accused me of manipulating an elderly woman. My brothers alternated between sulking and making pointed comments about people who take advantage of old ladies. But I hadn't manipulated anyone. I'd simply spent time with Grandma, listening to her stories about the house's history, the changes in the neighborhood, and the families who'd lived there over the decades. She'd often mentioned how important it was to preserve the past, to understand where we came from. What my family didn't know was that those conversations had become much more than nostalgic reminiscences. Grandma had witnessed things in that neighborhood over the years, things that had recently become very relevant to my work. I worked as a federal investigator specializing in organized crime and racketeering. My family thought I was a government clerk, because I'd never corrected their assumptions. It was easier to let them think I filed paperwork all day than to explain that I spent my time building cases against criminal organizations. The house on Maple Street sat directly across from what had been the longtime headquarters of the Torino crime family. For 60 years, Grandma had unknowingly documented the comings and goings of one of the city's most significant criminal enterprises. Her detailed journals, photo albums, and meticulous record-keeping had become crucial evidence in our ongoing federal investigation. When I inherited the house, I'd immediately informed my supervisor about the potential conflict of interest. The Bureau had been monitoring the Torino operation for 3 years, and Grandma's documentation provided the historical context we needed to establish patterns of criminal activity dating back decades. The house itself wasn't just valuable real estate, it was an active crime scene preservation site. Every room contained potential evidence. Grandma's photo albums showed decades of suspicious activity across the street. Her journals mentioned license plate numbers, unusual visitors, and strange late-night activities that perfectly corroborated our surveillance data. 6 months ago, the house had been quietly placed under federal protection as part of our case against Tony Torino and 15 of his associates. The property was legally designated as evidence, though this information was classified and couldn't be shared with my family. My brothers had spent the past year pressuring me to sell the house and split the proceeds 3 ways. They argued that keeping it was selfish, that Grandma wouldn't have wanted family fighting over money, and that I was being unreasonable by not cashing out immediately. "It's just sitting there empty," Marcus complained at every family gathering. "You're not even living in it." "The market's hot right now," David would add. "We could get way more than it's worth if we sell soon." "Sarah's being stubborn," Mom would sigh. "She's always been possessive of things that don't really belong to her." Dad's approach was more direct. "That house is too much responsibility for someone your age. Let your brothers handle the business side." But I couldn't sell the house because it wasn't really mine to sell anymore. Once property becomes evidence in a federal case, it's essentially frozen until the investigation concludes. The Bureau had been very clear. Any attempt to alter, sell, or transfer the property would constitute obstruction of justice. I tried to discourage my family's pressure without revealing the federal complications. "I'm not ready to sell yet," I'd say. "I want to go through Grandma's things first." "You've had 18 months, Marcus would snap. "How long does it take to pack up some old lady's junk?" "Some of us have real financial pressures," David would add. "That house represents serious money just sitting there doing nothing." The situation escalated 3 weeks ago when Marcus started bringing potential buyers to family dinners. Real estate agents, property developers, investors, anyone who might pressure me to sell quickly. "This is Sarah," he'd say, introducing me like I was an obstacle to overcome. "She's the one holding up the sale." The potential buyers would look at me with barely concealed irritation, as if I was a difficult child refusing to be reasonable about adult matters. "Sometimes family members get emotionally attached to properties," one agent explained condescendingly. "But holding on to real estate for sentimental reasons isn't financially smart." "I've seen this before," a developer added. "Young people inherit property and don't understand the carrying costs. Insurance, taxes, maintenance, it adds up quickly." My family nodded along, treating these strangers' opinions as expert validation of their own frustrations with my stubbornness. Last Sunday's family dinner had been the worst yet. Marcus arrived with a purchase agreement already filled out, missing only my signature and the final sale price. "I found a buyer willing to pay $380,000 cash," he announced, spreading the papers across Mom's dining table. "40,000 over market value. We can close in 2 weeks." "That's incredible," Mom gushed. "Sarah, you have to take this deal." Dad examined the paperwork approvingly. "This buyer is serious. Cash offers don't come along often." "I told him we'd have an answer by tomorrow," Marcus continued. "He's ready to put down earnest money immediately." David pulled out his phone calculator. "After closing costs and fees, we're looking at about $125,000 each. That's life-changing money." "For some of us anyway," Marcus said, glancing at me. "Though I guess when you're used to government salary, any amount seems huge." The comment stung because it revealed how little they thought of my career. In their minds, I was some low-level clerk grateful for whatever scraps came my way. "I can't sell the house right now," I said quietly. "Why not?" Mom demanded. "You've been saying that for over a year. What are you waiting for?" "I'm still going through Grandma's belongings." "So pack them up and take what you want," Dad said impatiently. "The buyer doesn't want the contents anyway. It's more complicated than that." Marcus slammed his hand on the table. "Everything's always complicated with you. Some of us have real responsibilities. My business needs capital and this sale could save my company. David's having trouble with his mortgage," Mom added. "This money could help both your brothers get back on their feet." "And what about Sarah's financial future?" David asked sarcastically. "Oh wait, she'll be fine. Government jobs have pensions." The dismissal was automatic and complete. In their minds, my stable federal employment meant I didn't need or deserve the inheritance money as much as my struggling brothers. I understand you both need money, I said carefully, but I can't sell the house yet. Can't or won't? Marcus demanded. There are legal complications. What legal complications? Dad asked sharply. The will was clear. You inherited the house free and clear. I couldn't explain that the property was frozen as evidence in a federal case. My security clearance prohibited me from discussing ongoing investigations, even with family. I just need more time, I said. Time for what? Mom asked, frustration evident in her voice. You're being selfish, Sarah. This isn't just about you anymore. Grandma left you that house because she trusted you to do the right thing, Dad added. Hoarding it while your brothers struggle isn't what she would have wanted. The guilt trip was familiar and effective. My family had always been experts at making me feel responsible for everyone else's problems while dismissing my own needs and concerns. I sold Grandma's house and kept the money, Marcus announced proudly at last night's family dinner. I looked up from my plate, confused. What do you mean? I found a buyer willing to pay $375,000 cash. We closed yesterday. Marcus was grinning like he'd just solved world hunger. You weren't using it anyway, Dad supported him immediately. Marcus took initiative while you were being indecisive. Mom nodded approvingly. Finally, someone in this family is thinking practically. How did you sell my house? I asked, my voice carefully controlled. I had copies of the deed from when we were getting everything appraised, Marcus explained. Found a buyer who wanted a quick transaction, no inspections, cash only. David helped with the paperwork, Dad added proudly. It pays to have someone in real estate in the family. We used Grandma's old power of attorney documents, David said casually. Technically, they were never officially revoked, so I was able to act as executor. I stared at my brothers, trying to process what they'd just told me. They'd forged legal documents to sell federal evidence in an active criminal investigation. The buyer was very understanding about the family situation, Marcus continued. He didn't ask too many questions about why the sale was being handled by the siblings instead of the heir. Some investors prefer to work with men anyway, Dad said approvingly. They know we understand business better than someone who's never had to make real financial decisions. Where's the money? I asked quietly. We split it 3 ways like it should have been from the beginning, Marcus said. Your share is in an account we set up for you. $125,000, minus the legal fees and commissions. You'll thank us later, Mom said confidently. This was the smart move financially. The buyer was very motivated, David added. Paid cash, no financing contingencies. The whole transaction took less than a week once we had the paperwork sorted out. I said quietly, I'll handle the paperwork. Marcus laughed. The paperwork's already handled. That's the beauty of having David involved. He knows how to get things done efficiently. You don't have to worry about any of the details, Dad assured me. Your brothers took care of everything. We even packed up Grandma's junk, Mom added. Most of it went to charity, but we saved a few photo albums and her jewelry for you. Everything else was just taking up space, Marcus said dismissively. Old newspapers, magazines, journals full of neighborhood gossip. Nothing worth keeping. My stomach dropped. Grandma's journals and photo albums were key evidence in our federal case. The neighborhood gossip, they'd thrown away documented 60 years of criminal activity. What did you do with the papers and journals? I asked carefully. Threw them out, David shrugged. Who keeps that much old paperwork? The buyer wanted the house empty anyway. Some of those documents might have been important. Important how? Marcus asked. They were just random notes about neighbors and old family stuff. Nothing valuable. We kept the photo albums with family pictures, Mom said defensively. But all those other papers were just clutter. Dad nodded agreement. Grandma was a pack rat. She kept every grocery receipt and newspaper clipping for decades. None of it was worth preserving. I excused myself from dinner and called my supervisor from my car. Agent Rodriguez, we have a problem, I said when he answered. What's happened? My family sold the Maple Street house. They also disposed of all the documentary evidence. There was a long pause. The protected property? The house that's been designated as evidence in the Torino case. Yes. They used forged power of attorney documents to complete an illegal sale. When? The sale closed yesterday. They threw away Grandma's journals and papers this week. Do you know who the buyer was? They mentioned cash sale, no inspections, quick closing. Someone who didn't ask questions about the irregular paperwork. Agent Rodriguez's voice hardened. We need to meet immediately. This is obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and possibly money laundering if the buyer was connected to our targets. What do I do about my family? Nothing yet. Don't let them know about the federal implications. We need to investigate the sale and identify the buyer before we take action. I drove home thinking about how quickly everything had unraveled. My brothers had committed multiple federal crimes trying to access money they thought they deserved. They destroyed evidence in a major organized crime case because they saw Grandma's documentation as worthless clutter. The next morning I was at the federal building early, meeting with Agent Rodriguez and the U.S. attorney assigned to the Torino case. We ran the buyer's information, Agent Rodriguez reported. Vincent Torino, Tony's nephew. He paid cash through a shell company. So this was deliberate, the prosecutor noted. They weren't just buying property. They were buying evidence and access to federal surveillance materials. What are the charges against my family? Obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and potentially conspiracy with organized crime if we can prove they knew about the buyer's connections. They didn't know. They just wanted the money. Their ignorance might reduce their sentences, but it doesn't eliminate their criminal liability. They sold federal evidence to organized crime figures. Agent Rodriguez laid out a timeline. We'll need to arrest your brothers immediately. The house sale will have to be reversed and we'll need to search for any remaining evidence. What about the documents they threw away? We'll check local dumps and waste management facilities, but realistically that evidence is probably lost forever. The prosecutor looked grim. Your brothers may have irreparably damaged a 3-year federal investigation. Depending on what evidence was destroyed, we might have to reconsider our entire approach to the Torino case. I thought about Marcus bragging about his business acumen, David proud of his real estate expertise, both of them convinced they'd outsmarted their foolish little sister who didn't understand practical financial matters. Within 24 hours, federal prosecutors filed obstruction charges against both my brothers. The FBI raided their homes and businesses, searching for any connection to the Torino organization and any remaining evidence from Grandma's house. Marcus was arrested at his construction site, in front of his employees and clients. Federal agents served warrants while he was meeting with potential customers, completely destroying his business reputation. David was taken into custody at the real estate office where he worked. His colleagues watched as FBI agents led him away in handcuffs, confiscating his computer and client files. My parents called frantically when they heard about the arrests. What's happening? Mom demanded. Why are federal agents arresting your brothers? They sold evidence in a federal criminal investigation, I explained. What evidence? It was just an old house. Grandma's house was across from an organized crime headquarters. Her journals and photos documented criminal activity for 60 years. There was silence on the phone. How do you know that? Because I'm the federal investigator assigned to the case. You're what? I work for the FBI, Mom. I've been building a case against the Torino crime family for 3 years. Grandma's documentation was crucial evidence. But you said you were a government clerk. I never said that. You assumed that because you never asked what I actually do for work. Mom's voice became small. Marcus and David are going to prison, aren't they? They sold federal evidence to the suspects we were investigating. Yes, they're going to prison. How long? Obstruction of justice carries up to 10 years. Evidence tampering is another 5. Conspiracy charges could add more time. I could hear Dad in the background asking what was wrong. Mom was crying now. They didn't know, she said desperately. They were just trying to help the family financially. Their intent doesn't matter. They committed federal crimes. Can you help them? You work for the FBI. Surely you have some influence. I'm a witness in their case now, Mom. I can't help them. The line went quiet except for Mom's sobbing. Your brothers called you selfish for not selling the house, she said finally. But you were protecting evidence the whole time. Yes. And we've been treating you like you were the problem. Yes. Dad took the phone. Sarah, I don't understand how this happened. You and Mom spent 18 months pressuring me to sell federal evidence. You supported Marcus and David when they decided to commit crimes to get access to money they weren't entitled to. We didn't know. You didn't know because you never asked. You assumed I was incompetent and incapable of understanding my own situation. What happens now? Marcus and David will be prosecuted for federal crimes. The house sale will be reversed. The organized crime family they sold evidence to will use this obstruction to argue that our investigation was compromised. What about the money? It's evidence now. Frozen until the trial. Dad was quiet for a long moment. Your brothers were just trying to solve their financial problems. By committing felonies. They didn't understand the consequences. They didn't care about the consequences. They saw something they wanted and took it regardless of my rights or the legal implications. The conversation ended with Dad hanging up on me. Over the next week, more details emerged about my brother's crimes. Marcus had used the illegal proceeds to pay off business debts, thinking he'd solved his financial problems overnight. David had put his share toward a down payment on a new house, celebrating what he thought was his escape from mortgage troubles. Neither had considered that the money might not be legally theirs to keep. The federal investigation revealed that Vincent Torino had been looking for ways to access the Maple Street house for months. When Marcus and David started shopping the property around, he'd identified them as useful opportunities to gain access to evidence that could damage his family's criminal enterprise. Your brothers were essentially recruited as unwitting accomplices, Agent Rodriguez explained. The Torino organization used their greed and ignorance to destroy federal evidence. Will this destroy the case? We're assessing the damage. Some evidence can be reconstructed, but we've lost decades of documented surveillance data that can't be replaced. The U.S. Attorney's Office offered my brothers plea agreements, 7 years in federal prison in exchange for full cooperation and testimony about their contact with Vincent Torino. Marcus accepted immediately, terrified by the prospect of a 20-year sentence if convicted at trial. David held out longer, convinced that his real estate license and clean criminal record would convince a jury he was just an unlucky businessman caught up in family drama. His lawyer eventually convinced him otherwise. Both brothers pled guilty to obstruction of justice and conspiracy charges. Marcus received 7 years and 3 months in federal prison. David got 6 years and 8 months due to his cooperation in identifying other properties the Torino family had been trying to access. My parents attended both sentencing hearings, sitting in the back row while federal judges explained how their son's greed had compromised a major organized crime investigation. The defendants' actions weren't just theft from their sister, Judge Martinez said during Marcus's sentencing. They were crimes against the justice system itself, committed in partnership with the very criminals federal agents were trying to apprehend. Their ignorance of federal law doesn't excuse their willingness to forge documents and steal protected property, Judge Williams added during David's hearing. The damage to ongoing investigations is immeasurable and irreversible. After the sentencing, Mom approached me in the courthouse hallway. I owe you an apology, she said quietly. We treated you terribly. Yes, you did. We thought you were being stubborn and selfish. We had no idea you were protecting evidence. You had no idea because you never respected me enough to ask what I was actually doing or why I might have legitimate reasons for my decisions. Dad joined us, looking older than I'd ever seen him. Your brothers are going to federal prison because we pushed them to steal from you. They're going to prison because they chose to commit crimes, I corrected. You all decided I was incompetent and unworthy of basic respect. That's what led to this. How do we fix this? Mom asked. You don't. Marcus and David will serve their sentences. The federal investigation they damaged will proceed without the evidence they destroyed. And I'll continue my career knowing that my own family was willing to sabotage my work because they thought I was too stupid to manage my own inheritance. I walked away from my parents that day and haven't spoken to them since. The house on Maple Street was eventually returned to federal custody after Vincent Torino's purchase was legally voided. The property remains sealed as evidence while the reduced case against his family proceeds through the courts. My brothers are currently serving their sentences in different federal facilities. They'll be eligible for parole in 5 years if they maintain good behavior and continue cooperating with ongoing investigations. I still work organized crime cases, though I've been transferred to different investigations to avoid any appearance of conflict. My new colleagues know me as a thorough investigator who understands the importance of protecting evidence and maintaining security protocols. Sometimes family members think they know what's best for you. Sometimes they're so convinced of their own expertise that they'll commit federal crimes to override your decisions. And sometimes, the quiet family member they've been dismissing for years turns out to be the one person who understood the stakes all along. The federal justice system doesn't care about family dynamics or financial pressures. It cares about evidence, truth, and the rule of law. My brothers learned that lesson too late in a federal courtroom, wearing orange jumpsuits and wondering how their get-rich-quick scheme had destroyed their lives. I learned it much earlier, which is why I spent 3 years quietly protecting evidence while my family spent 3 years loudly demanding I destroy it. In the end, patience and professionalism won out over greed and arrogance. But the cost was higher than anyone had imagined. 2 brothers in federal prison, parents who finally understood their youngest daughter's real capabilities, and a major criminal investigation permanently damaged by family members who thought they knew better than the federal agent they'd never bothered to understand.